Hello and welcome to Military History Inside Out, where we talk about military history from ancient to modern and everything in between. I'm Chris Alvarez, and today's guest is Garth Ennis, who's written a graphic novel about a specific aviation arm in the Royal Navy during World War II. Thank you for listening. I'm speaking with Garth Ennis, author of The Stringbags, published or to be published May 20th, 2020 by Naval Institute Press. I think that date still stands. Thank you for speaking with me.
Oh, pleasure.
I know a lot of people will know your name for your comic book writing. Personally, I know you for The Preacher, but you've also written a lot of military history comic books.
That's right. I've written a lot of war comics, more and more as time goes by, really. Very much a reflection of the kind of comics I grew up on, that I was reading while it seems almost everyone else who's ended up in the business was reading superheroes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I want to ask, how did your interest in military history start, and why did you decide to write on it?
Well, I think it grew out of war comics that I read as a kid. As I say, that's what I was reading when other people were reading more traditional comics there. It really comes down to a quirk of distribution in the part of Northern Ireland I grew up in, where we got very few international imports, very few American comics, very few British independent titles. We really just got the British mainstream titles. So whereas friends of mine who lived in Belfast were able to get a lot more American comics, I saw very, very few. And the British titles I read were 2000 AD, which is most famous for featuring Judge Dredd, and a series of war comics titles, which were still pretty popular in the 70s and early 80s. And I think it was reading those and reading stories where I was, even as a kid, dimly aware that were based on reality, based on things that people had actually done, put the hook in me in a way that fantasy didn't, or perhaps they've endured. That notion of stories based in the real world has endured with me better than the fantasy stories I read as a kid. And so that led me to an understanding, once I achieved the understanding that, yes, these things had happened, and allowing for the sometimes outrageous hyperbole of the war comics, that they were based on real things, real events, real people. That's what led me into an interest in military history. And eventually, when I was writing my own comics, when I got the opportunity, I wanted to bring the whole thing full circle and start doing my own war comics.
Now, was World War II your primary military history interest, or did it range?
It was the primary interest, really. I am interested in other 20th century conflicts. First World War, Korea, and Vietnam. Quite early on, I did develop an interest in the Vietnam War, again, oddly enough, from a strip I read in a British comic. But really, the bulk of the comics I read were based on World War II stories, and that's pretty much how I've ended up. I do vary it a little bit. I have written about other conflicts, quite a bit about Vietnam, actually. But yes, the bulk of the work I do is based around World War II.
So since your work is often sometimes described as like gritty, even your sort of fantastic superhero stuff, do you think your interest in military history, did it start out, just as a kid, you're interested in the action of it, and then did it become more mature, or how did your interest develop over time?
I think if there is a darker or grittier side to my work, I think it comes from British comics in general, rather than being specific to war comics. In terms of what was allowed to be shown British comics of the 70s were that bit nearer the knuckle than their American counterparts. I think it was the what's been called the British invasion of people like Alan Moore and so on in the 80s that really brought that sensibility to American comics. Before that, you didn't really see it. So I would say it's the comics I read as a whole, and perhaps also the TV shows I watched and some of the movies I saw that fed into what you're talking about, rather than anything specific to war stories.
So let's talk about the Stringbags then. Considering how many different stories there are in World War II that could be told, how did this one rise up from what was available to you?
Yeah. For the past 20 years, I suppose, for the bulk of my career, I've been working my way through the war stories that interest me the most. And I always knew I was going to write something about the Swordfish crews, the British torpedo bomber pilots. And this isn't going to be a particularly brilliant answer, but it was just their turn. Circumstances conspired. I had a publisher who was very sympathetic with Dead Reckoning, the imprint of the Naval Institute Press. I had just the right artist in P.J. Holden. My schedule was at the right point. And I thought, okay, there's a number of them I want to write about the most, given the schedule. And I thought it's a Swordfish story.
So obviously this Royal Naval Air Arm. Well, first I want to ask, I guess obviously you focused on the British one. Was there any interest in looking at swordfish operations from other countries? A few other navies had them as well, or did you just want to stick to the British?
No, it was really just my interest in the British Navy's exploits. That, I think, that is where the Swordfish story is at its most epic. When you consider Toronto, the Bismark, the Channel Dash. I don't think there's anything else in the Swordfish story that comes anywhere near matching that. That's not to say that the British in particular didn't do a lot of other very important work with the Swordfish, mining, rocket attacks against shipping, and so on. But I think it's those three that epitomize the Swordfish story better than anything else. This little canvas skin, flimsy-looking biplane that somehow achieves the near impossible in the face of terrible odds.
Now, did you take their three most memorable exploits to focus on, or how did you make the choice?
Well, that's exactly what I did. With Toronto and the Bismark and the Channel Dash, I thought you had a good arc where we begin with the untried aircraft and their untried crews. Obviously, I don't want to give away too much for the story for anyone who hasn't read it, but we begin with this midnight attack on the Italian fleet at harbour. We then see the crews taking on the massive German battleship Bismark in mid-Atlantic when it looks as if she's going to get clean away. And then we come to the climax of the story in the Channel Dash as the Germans attempt to run 3 capital ships down the English Channel, and the British go all out to stop them, and the Swordfish crews get caught up in that particular effort. Those were really the 3 events that suggested themselves to me as the most crucial.
Now, I think in the blurb I read that whereas the operations you discuss are historical, the crew themselves, you created fictional characters for that?
That's correct, yeah.
Okay.
The three guys in our crew, Archie, Ollie, and Pops, Swordfish had 3-man crews, are indeed fictional. There were a couple of reasons for that. One was that no single crew in real life took part in all 3 actions. I think there may have been a little bit of spillover, but there were many Swordfish squadrons, many carriers from which they flew, and many theaters in which they saw action, and so it's not surprising. that there wasn't a single crew that did all these things. The way I saw it was that the nature of the events that feature in the story, again, Toronto, the Bismark, the Channel Dash, are so epic, they're so grand in scope, that they were in danger of overwhelming the characters and turning the story into quite a dry documentary. Mm-hmm. And it seemed to me the only way to do that was to come up with three characters with whom we could empathize. We could move through the story with them. We could see their highs and lows, their triumphs and tragedies. If I'd done the book purely as a documentary, if I'd shown you what happened in each of the three actions, and perhaps I'd tried to highlight a few of the personalities involved in the story, well, with each successive chapter, you'd have to forget about the people who were in the last one and move on to completely new characters. Mm-hmm. And that's what I mean when I say that I think that the events would have overwhelmed the personalities. By having three fictional but constant characters in the story, we will hopefully have a little bit of human interest to focus on, mm-hmm. And that will mean that the events won't become too awe-inspiring, too all-encompassing, mm-hmm. And we'll have, hopefully, enough of a human interest to carry the reader through the story. The other thing, and this is a more minor point, is that I've always believed in all the war stories I've written that there's something perhaps a little unethical about taking real-life characters and giving them the dialogue, the beliefs and the attitudes that you want them to have for your story. They may not have ever held or expressed opinions like the ones you're putting in their mouths at all. I wrote a story a couple of years ago called Dreaming Eagles about the Tuskegee Airmen, and I did the same thing there. I created fictional characters who I then moved through a more or less real-life story, because, again, I didn't want to put my dialogue, my opinions, my attitudes in the mouths of people who really existed. I feel as if there'd be an element of disrespect there. Mm-hmm. And, again, fictional characters will help with that.
I'm speaking with Garth Ennis, author of the graphic novel The Stringbags. You can find him by Googling his name, Garth Ennis, to find his other works. If you like this podcast, please take a moment to rate it on whatever podcast feed you're listening to it on. These ratings go a long way in increasing the popularity of my podcast, and I'm grateful for any support you can give me. Please sign up for my newsletter at warscholar.org or militaryhistorypodcast.com. Please post your questions or comments about this podcast or this episode on Facebook at War Scholar and on YouTube at War Scholar 1945. You can also contact me on Twitter at War Scholar and on Instagram at Chris Alvarez War Scholar. If you like science fiction, fantasy, and horror, please listen to my podcast Full Contact Nerd, located at chrisalvarez.com and fullcontactnerd.com. If you like outer space, business, technology, and policy, please listen to my podcast Spacewalks Money Talks, also located at spacewalksmoneytalks.com. Now back to the podcast. And where the character is drawn, and you don't have to name anyone specifically, but where the character is drawn from anyone you came across in doing the research, or any kind of personalities that you were familiar with already?
Not really. Again, I was anxious to avoid my characters even being stand-ins for real people. Okay. I simply wanted them to be an almost generic swordfish crew, rather than being the elite, the very best, simply being three almost everymen who happen to find themselves in that situation. Mm-hmm. That said, I do occasionally borrow instances of real-life behavior and attribute them to my fictional characters. There is a scene towards the climax of the book when Ollie, the observer, stands up in his cockpit to make rude gestures and yell abuse at the attacking German fighters even as they're screaming over his head with their ejected cannon shell casings bouncing off the fuselage of the Swordfish, because that happened in real life.
Yeah.
To me, that's something that's just too good not to put in.
Mm-hmm.
Likewise, during the attack on the Bismarck, Ollie finds himself leaning over the side of the aircraft, yelling to the pilot the exact moment at which he should let go of the torpedo, so that it hits a wave rather than the crest of the wave, and just so that it runs true. Again, that was done in real life, and that is something, by the way, that I acknowledge in the afterword of the book. This is real life behavior with fictional characters carrying it out.
One thing I noted, so the operation against the Bismarck, I did an interview about the Dam Busters with Max Hastings, and I believe... Right. And there's a bit, I'm not sure if it was in his book or elsewhere I came across this, but those pilots were worried that they'd have to attack the Bismarck, that their special operation was against the Bismarck, and they were almost relieved that it was something else. So it's interesting that your book talks about an attack on the Bismarck.
Might it have been the Tirpitz? I think it might have been the Tirpitz, because by the time 617 Squadron was formed, the Bismarck had been sunk a couple of years previously. I think 617 were a bit worried that they were going to have to use their bombs against the Bismarck's sister ship, the Tirpitz. Which was tucked away in a Norwegian fjord at the time. And in fact, interestingly enough, later in the war they were given different bombs, gigantic bunker-busting 12,000-pound bombs, which they did in fact use on the Tirpitz. But yes, I'm sure in 1943, with the Bismarck's reputation, the thought of having to attack her sister ship would have been a bit of a spine chiller for any RAF troop. Yeah,
no problem correcting me there. That's I'm glad to hear, to get the correct information out.
Sure. I mean, double check that, but I'm pretty sure that would be the case.
Okay. Yeah. So the story does seem to be, so again, you mentioned, the exploits were so grand, and then you have these characters you're trying to develop within this large stage. What would you say you focus on, like thematically? Can you say there's things you focus on in the book, in this graphic novel, that you can point out?
What I tried to do was develop three characters who perhaps weren't the best at the job. They still had to be pretty good. They were chosen to take part in attacks which only a dozen or perhaps 24 British aircraft were involved in, so that they would be pretty good. But I wanted to avoid the notion of them being the very best of the best, the ace fighter pilot, the superstar. I was more interested in what I referred to earlier as everymen. They're the kind of guys who, perhaps they're not the most motivated, perhaps they're not the most capable, but they're there, and for one reason or another, they go on the mission anyway. There's what before I've referred to as a kind of heroism of endurance there. So I wanted to see them as guys who, I think early on, Archie, the pilot, is described as flying the way he does everything else, all balls and no brains. Ollie doesn't really take life terribly seriously. He's the observer. And then the gunner, Pops, I think he himself points out that he's been in the Navy almost 10 years, and he really hasn't enjoyed much in the way of promotion or of advancement. So, he can tell that there's something not quite right about his own attitude. And yet, these three guys are there. They go on the missions. They do the job. They themselves do question what they're doing on occasion. They do have a sense of their luck slowly running out, of they themselves getting away with more and more, and wondering how much longer can this last. And yet, they continue to show up. They're in the line. They go on the mission. So I wanted that sense of quiet courage, shown by ordinary human beings rather than necessarily some sort of far more heroic archetype that we're perhaps used to in war stories.
Mm-hmm. Did you find that the pilots, because I guess the description of these planes has been museum pieces before the war, were the pilots chosen for this work? Were they generally the guys, the B team, that was put to work at this, or do you know how that was approached?
Not really. I mean, these were, as I say, very capable people. Mm-hmm. It's just that within any group, you're going to get the most motivated individuals, and then you're going to get the ones that perhaps the more callow, youthful ones who aren't completely certain about what they're doing, for whom life in the military, life as aviators is a bit of a lark until the bullets start flying and they find out what it's really all about. But there's no question that these pilots and crews were very capable people. They were the simple fact that they were able to get at least one torpedo hit against the Bismarck in the mid-Atlantic in pretty grim conditions as the light is failing at the end of the day would suggest that there's a degree of skill involved or on show beyond that of the average aviator. But again, you have your very best, you have your elite, and then you have your guys who, I wouldn't go so far as to say they're there to make up the numbers, far from it, but they're perhaps they're better at trying than they are at actually doing.
Mm-hmm. And I don't want to use the term B team sort of pejoratively, because I know that, the people who are just kind of supposed to do that secondary duty sometimes come out to be the ones doing the heroic stuff,
Sure. I mean, none of this was secondary duty. This was the Royal Navy's premier strike arm. If the story has a point in that regard at all, it's not that the crews were second best. It's that the aircraft itself, the Swordfish, certainly seemed to be second best at the beginning of the war. I think I make the point in the afterword that the Swordfish wasn't taken very seriously at first, but that's because its crews had yet to get down to work. Once they took the thing to war, it actually defied the odds and, in fact, triumphed.
Now, was it? Did it primarily fly from land bases, or how often were they flown from aircraft carriers?
I believe it was mostly a carrier-based aircraft. That's what it was designed for. But there were plenty of Royal Naval Air Stations around the UK from which Swordfish flew on perhaps shorter range submarine hunting and mine-laying operations. And
how slow was the plane?
I think it was supposed to be able to do about 120 miles an hour. But once you got the men aboard and the torpedo underneath and you allowed for the wear and tear that the engine and the airframe took, I think they were lucky to get it much over about 100. And when you consider that 20 years earlier, the very best fighters of the First World War had already surpassed that particular speed, you get a sense of really what you're talking about with the Swordfish performance. The torpedo bombers that the American Navy began World War II with weren't all that great. They got far better aircraft later in the war, but they were still a downside faster and more modern than the Swordfish.
Yeah, one thing I like about this this book is that, when you think about British aviation in World War II, you think, I guess, the Spitfire and I guess the Hurricane, and know, to learn about this is pretty cool.
Yeah, it's I suppose it's one of those unsung hero stories. I mean, I can remember being a kid and reading 2 or 3 war comics featuring the Swordfish, and finding something incongruous about this old canvas-skinned biplane in amongst all these deadly-looking monoplane fighters and bombers. Not that I would have expressed it like that at the time, but I think the anachronistic nature of the Swordfish was very much played up in those comics. And when you read the memoirs of some of the men who flew it, like Charles Lamb, who wrote "To War in a Stringbag," they are not unaware of the nature of the aircraft they're flying. They're very pleased with it and proud of it once they get going, but you do find them asking questions early in the aircraft service of what's going to happen if we ever run into German fighters, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. Is it, not being British, I don't know, is the Stringbag or the Stringbags, how much are they celebrated in the UK?
Well, in as much as any World War II story is really properly celebrated in the UK, let's say they're known within specialist circles. Most people who know a bit about military history will know what a Fairey Swordfish is, and they'll be familiar with the Bismark and Toronto. But in terms of the general public, really not at all. In recent years, there's been a big effort to, in September, to get large numbers of Spitfires and Hurricanes into the air to celebrate the climax of the Battle of Britain. And I think that's raised certainly the Spitfire's profile a bit with the general public. You might be able to make the same argument for the Lancaster bomber. But apart from that, no. And again, unless you know a little bit about military history, or you go to, say, an air show and see one of the very rare Swordfish that's still flying, then you're really not going to know. To be frank with you, I think Americans do a far better job of commemorating their World War II experience than the British do.
Interesting. How great were the losses of these planes in World War II?
Well, if we look at the three actions that that feature in the book, The Stringbags, surprisingly light for the first two. One of the points that the book makes is that the enemy gunners simply weren't ready for an aircraft that slow. Anti-aircraft gunners will assume that the aircraft they're shooting at is going to behave in a certain way. They'll aim ahead of it so that it will fly into their fire. There's a lot of complicated black magic here to do with prediction, geometry, mathematics, and so on. But essentially, it's leading the target. It's deflection shooting. You shoot where the aircraft is, where you think it's going to be, and it flies into your fire. The Swordfish had a funny habit of defying their expectations because it was so slow. And so against the Italian fleet at Toronto and against the German gunners on the Bismarck, the Swordfish fared surprisingly well. Unfortunately, later in the Channel Dash action, up against German fighters, it was rather a different story. Again, that's a bit of a spoiler alert, but let's just say it didn't work out so well for them the third time.
Yeah. And even with the first two engagements that you focus on, not losing planes and pilots it's not a bad thing. That's good. It just shows how useful they were. But I'm sure it was terrifying still.
Oh, yes, absolutely. I mean, flying into a storm of tracer and flak with shrapnel flying all over the place and ripping through your little canvas-skinned aircraft. It's worth noting that a good many Swordfish, once they got back to the carrier with their crews intact, had to be written off and tipped over the side because they were just shredded. I mean, they lasted long enough to make the attack and return their crews safely. And then some of them, at least, would simply be tipped overboard because they were in such terrible condition. There was no point in attempting to patch them up. There'd be more patches than aircraft.
Wow. So they were still manufacturing them at the time, where they just, I assume?
Yes, I believe Swordfish the manufacture of the aircraft continued not through the whole war, because towards the end of the war they were beginning to get decent modern aircraft. The British Fleet Air Arm was lucky to get an American torpedo bomber called the Grumman Avenger, which gradually took over from the Swordfish. But it did last a good long while. Fairey, the parent company, came up with a replacement for the Swordfish called the Albacore, and it frankly failed. And I think in at least one instance, there was one Swordfish squadron that got rid of its Albacores and went back to Swordfish.
I'm speaking with Garth Ennis, author of the graphic novel The Stringbags. You can find him by Googling his name, Garth Ennis, to find his other works. If you like this podcast, please take a moment to rate it on whatever podcast feed you're listening to it on. These ratings go a long way in increasing the popularity of my podcast, and I'm grateful for any support you can give me. Please sign up for my newsletter at warscholar.org or militaryhistorypodcast.com. Please post your questions or comments about this podcast or this episode on Facebook at War Scholar and on YouTube at War Scholar 1945. You can also contact me on Twitter at War Scholar and on Instagram at Chris Alvarez War Scholar. If you like science fiction, fantasy, and horror, please listen to my podcast Full Contact Nerd, located at chrisalvarez.com and fullcontactnerd.com. If you like outer space, business, technology, and policy, please listen to my podcast Spacewalks Money Talks, also located at spacewalksmoneytalks.com. Now back to the podcast. I also want to ask about, really quickly, the armament. So, and also I noted that I think it uses centrometric radar at one point.
Yes. The radar, aircraft-borne radar, kind of improves dramatically throughout the war. The sets that the crews are using early on are, well, not terribly reliable. It's the same with air-to-air radar. Early British night fighters had a pretty terrible time with the equipment they were given, but that improved quickly as the war went on. As for armament, the Swordfish had a little rifle caliber machine gun at the back for the gunner, and a single one firing forward for the pilot to do whatever damage he might. It could carry, obviously, a torpedo, or bombs, or flares, or mines, depending on which job it was supposed to do. That's where the nickname Stringbag comes from, the fact that it could carry so many different things. Put someone in mind of the kind of string shopping bags that were in use at the time.
Oh, okay.
And so this slightly derogatory but affectionate nickname was given. Later in the war, I believe Swordfish were also equipped with rockets, 4 under each wing, which proved quite devastating against surfaced U-boats and so on. But at the point our story takes place, from 1940 to early 42, we're really just concerned with the torpedo.
Okay. And it would carry one torpedo per plane, or?
One torpedo per plane, yeah. Once you got rid of that was it. You had to go home.
Mm-hmm. And were they able to fly a lot faster once the torpedo was deployed?
A bit faster, yeah, but still nowhere near fast enough to get away from enemy fighters and so on. I mean, pretty much anything in the sky was faster than a Swordfish.
I guess I was just wondering if the pilot or if the crew were just hoping to get it off, get it out, and then head home as quickly as possible once they did their job. Possibly
so. I mean, I think each of them was dedicated enough to do the job right. But after that, there's not a lot of point in sticking around, unless, I suppose, you want to make a second attack alongside another aircraft that still has a torpedo to draw enemy fire away from them, as happened several instances during the Dambusters raid. I'm not sure if Swordfish crews did that. I imagine some did at some point.
Okay. So let's turn towards the resources you used for your research. I've noted, or I read again in a book description that there's a lot of detail in, you know, the illustrations and what's shown in the graphic novel. What sort of research did you do for all that?
Well, when it comes to the detail, it's actually illustrated. That, in fact, is more of a question for the artist, P.J. Holden. I imagine, you know, he used particular textbooks and so on. For myself, it was whenever I research a story, it's often a question of fine-tuning the knowledge I already have. I mean, I have wanted to tell this story for a long time. As I said earlier, you know, it was just its turn to be told. But whenever I come to tell a particular war story, I draw on my own general knowledge, and then I'll use particular books to kind of fine-tune the details. As an example, on this one, I referred to a book I talked about earlier, Charles Lamb's book, The War in a String Bag. He was a swordfish pilot. He was involved in the Toronto attack. Before that, he'd actually had an aircraft carrier torpedoed out from under him by a U-boat right at the start of World War II. But he came back from that. He took part in the Toronto attack, a number of other missions around the Mediterranean. Interestingly, he was shot down and captured by the Vichy French and spent some time in a rather wretched prison camp in, I think, Tunisia or Algeria. It's a little outside the parameters of the story I told, but it is interesting. It's another one of those lesser-known aspects of the war. But it's that kind of specialist knowledge that I use to, as I say, fine-tune my own research.
Now, not just for this novel, but the others. What do you generally work off your own library, or do you ever get out to museums, archives, any oral history or anything that you listen to?
I do find a hell of a lot of stuff online. And of course, museum visits, being up close to the aircraft or vehicles or whatever artifacts you're talking about is invaluable. I mean, I've been very fortunate in that I've been able to fly in a number of World War II aircraft, which gives you an insight really unmatched by any textbook, any museum visit, to actually see how it sounds and feels and looks close up. I had a flight in a Lancaster bomber over Toronto 6 or 7 years ago, and that was an incomparable experience. Seeing what it's like inside a Lancaster with all four engines roaring at altitude, seeing how difficult it is to move around inside the thing, and then imagine what it would be like a couple of miles higher on oxygen at night. It really was, as I say, invaluable.
That sounds pretty cool. And so the Fairey Swordfish, have you been able to fly in that, or were you just able to see it on the ground? Or
no, I've seen them on the ground, and in fact, I saw one fly at a British air show some years ago. There are a couple of flying swordfish in the UK, and I think there's another one somewhere in North America. It may be Canadian, it may be American-owned, I'm just not sure, but they are incredibly rare. Being up close to one is an experience, though, when you see just how small it is and how flimsy it looks, and then you consider what it and its crews achieved. Yeah, that's quite an experience.
And then just the temperatures that you feel, how cold it must be when you're up.
Right.
Yeah.
Right, in an open cockpit, wearing only a fur-lined flying jacket over your overalls, as opposed to the kind of survival gear that people would wear nowadays. Yeah, I mean, I have been up in not necessarily World War II era aircraft, but I have been up in similar biplanes, and you do get a strong sense there of the wind in the wires, as the old saying has it. Open cockpit, wind right in your face if you lean around the windscreen, seeing the wires and struts that hold the two wings together. It doesn't it doesn't look very strong, although once you're up on the thing, you realize that the two wings with all those struts and strings actually do give the airframe a good deal of structural strength.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Is aviation your favorite part of military history, or is it evenly split?
I'd have to say it probably is my favorite part. It's where my interest began. I was always, as a kid, most fascinated by the exploits of the fighter pilots and, well, fictional fighter pilots at first. These were war comics, but there is something about aircraft of that era screaming around the sky with guns blazing that really does have a lock on my imagination that almost no other aspect of the war does.
Mm-hmm. When was the first time you got to see an air museum, or do you recall that?
When I was a kid, there was a museum just down the road from where I grew up called it's still there, the Ulster Folk and Transport Museum. Mm-hmm. And for a while, it had a Spitfire sitting outside it. Mm-hmm. And I can remember seeing that as a little kid, and because it was a post-war aircraft and was painted silver, it bore no resemblance or very little resemblance to the camouflaged aircraft I knew from the comics and the movies. Yeah. But it was a Spitfire, and I suppose it would have been my first experience of being up close to an aircraft like that. Funnily enough, you're talking about the 70s, when I'm not even 10, but about 20 years later, I saw that self-same Spitfire fly at an air show. Someone had purchased it from the museum, refurbished it, put a new engine in it, repainted it, and got it in the air. So it was nice to actually sort of see this thing from my childhood flying above my head.
That's cool. Yeah, to imagine how long it can sit there and then it can still take to the air and perform.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose by that stage, they've had to rebuild quite a lot of it, and you do wonder how much of the original structure is actually part of what flies today. Mm-hmm. Certainly, I doubt it was the original engine.
Right.
But yes, essentially, it's that Spitfire there in spirit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the research for this this work and others, what part of the research has been most enjoyable for you?
Well, sometimes it's not even research, it's just general reading, and that will spark the story. The story goes back to these comics I read as a kid. Other times you'll be just doing some general reading, or perhaps you'll be researching another story altogether, and something you run across will give you an idea for something completely new. You'll see a scene, or there'll be an anecdote. Mm-hmm. Something will set you off down the path to a new story. You mentioned Max Hastings earlier. Mm-hmm. I really do think he's a tremendous writer on World War II and other subjects. And one of the excellent World War II histories he's put out is one that it's called. Well, in the U.S. it was released as Inferno. In the U.K. it was called All Hell Let Loose. But it's not quite a social history of World War II, but it's perhaps a history of human experience. He tries to get as many different points of view and experiences as possible. Everyone from, I may be accidentally quoting the blurb on the back of the book here, but everyone from an American general to a Leningrad housewife during the siege, from a Japanese soldier to a British general to, you get the idea. Mm-hmm. And it is this incredible amalgamation of human experience. And reading that, like a lot of Max Hastings books, I almost find something I want to write about on every page.
Yeah. And yet there's such limited time.
Yes. I mean, I know, I've said this before, I know I'm going to die with ideas for war stories unused, because after the Stringbags, There are so many more I want to tell, so many things I want to get onto. I mean, I'm just looking at my bookshelf now, and I'm seeing about maybe 10 or a dozen war stories there, and I'm pleased with the vast majority of them. In fact, some of them are collected editions, which might have 3 or 4 different ones in each volume, so it's a lot more than just a dozen. And yet, I know that I've barely scratched the surface.
What's the, I noticed you revived a war comic. Can you briefly mention that?
Yeah, sure. I've done that a couple of times, old British characters, but I think the one I might have mentioned is Johnny Red, which is one of the very first war comics I read. That appeared in the British title I mentioned earlier, Battle. It was the story of a British fighter pilot who's kicked out of the RAF, and for reasons best known to the story, makes his way to Russia, where he ends up commanding a Russian fighter squadron. Now, this, of course, is unlikely to the point of impossibility, but it did provide the writer and artists to give the battle readership a pretty good introduction to the war on the Eastern Front, which as kids in the 70s we had really no idea of. We were taught a sort of truncated version of World War II history, in as much as we were taught anything, in which the British and Americans were very much to the fore in terms of the defeat of Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. But what these guys tried to do, the creators of Johnny Red, their names were Tom Tully and Joe Colquhoun, was to give us a portrait of conflict on the Russian front, in which it gradually became apparent that really the donkey work of the defeat of the Nazis had been done. The really hard graft of achieving that victory. And I was always impressed by that, the thought that these British comics writers and artists would want to do this. Yes, they had to do it by unlikely means. They had to choose this very, downright impossible plot where you have a British pilot, and that's how they get our interest, because he's a Brit.
Right.
But leading a Russian squadron. But that allows them to tell the story that otherwise simply wouldn't have been told. And it opened up that side of the war, and it gave an understanding of that side of the war to so many kids. In this one particular case, I can tell you it stayed with me. Yeah.
No, I think that's important, even if it's fictionalized. As long as the reader understands I'm reading fiction, but it is giving me useful information, and they can always research more on their own.
Well, yeah, that's right. I mean, that's why whenever I can, I include an afterword or an introduction to the war stories I write, just to tell people, fact and fiction is what I titled it in the Stringbags, just to tell people this is what happened, these are the true aspects of the story you've just read, these are the bits I've made up, these characters didn't exist, these guys did, that kind of thing. I think so long as you're honest about your sources in that way, it's fair enough.
Yeah, and even, academic history a reader should always, if they really take it to heart, should double check, with other sources.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Yeah, read, as in all things, read as widely as possible.
So for this novel, what was the most surprising thing you discovered?
Good. I think, and this would be back in the mists of time when I first encountered the swordfish. It would, if it wasn't the actual existence of this ancient creaking biplane in World War II itself, it was the thought that men took it into battle. So rather than there being one single aspect that was more surprising than anything else, it's actually the very heart of the story that I think is the most eye-opening aspect. The fact that men got in these things and flew them into action against then modern battleships bristling with firepower, against which they really did not expect to survive. That, to me, is the part of the story that stops me in my tracks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Was there a question or an historical fact or issue that you had particular difficulty getting an answer to that you were trying to write about in the story, or did you feel like you had everything down pat?
I was pretty confident in what I was doing. If you asked the artist, PJ, if you asked him what it was like to focus on some particular accursed detail of the swordfish's design, or perhaps some naval rank badge that was only relevant for 3 months of the story, some gruesome little detail that he had to get right, and he found himself screaming with frustration at 3 o'clock in the morning when he was trying to hunt it down online. If you asked him, yes, you might get a very different answer.
So you have talked about the importance of the story, the characters, the humanity of it, but was there anything else in the story that had an emotional impact on you, either positively or negatively?
Well, there were many things. I do think there is something about the Germans who the Stringbag crews flew against in the last section of the story, the Channel Dash. Mm-hmm. The Germans providing a kind of ultimate praise for those men, acknowledging their bravery, even as the two sides were trying to wipe each other out. Mm-hmm. There's something quite poignant about that, I think, where perhaps the final word on the Swordfish crews goes to the men who were trying to kill them, to be specifically German admiral who organized the Channel Dash and the captain of the Scharnhorst, which was one of the capital ships that made the dash. Yes, I was very impressed by that, and that's one of those instances where sometimes history, when you're writing fiction like this, sometimes history will give you just a line or lines that you need.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what do you hope this this graphic novel will do?
Well, I hope it will, like a lot of the war stories I read, I hope it will open people's eyes to an aspect of history, in this case of World War II, that they hadn't heard of before or hadn't considered. Mm-hmm. It is, as we've said, pretty epic stuff. Hopefully the characters and the situations in the story will carry the audience through it enough so that they'll be able to get a sense of these men and what they did, the people and the aspects of history that might otherwise simply be lost. Mm-hmm. After all, it's let's see, it's now about 80 years since the events that the story describes. Mm-hmm. And the generation that took part in it are quickly leaving us. After all, if you were 20 in 1940, mm-hmm. you're 100 now. So in just a few years, I think all the World War II veterans will be gone. Yeah. Given that the battles they fought gave us the world that we have today, mm-hmm. As opposed to a very grim alternative, I, for one, feel a responsibility to keep as many other stories alive as possible.
Oh yeah, definitely. Sort of a business question. Do comic book stores, I guess they'll carry this, but how much do they promote it versus maybe in standard bookstores, or are you able to answer that question or address it?
Well, that's a good question. To get a precise answer, you might talk to the people at Dead Reckoning. Mm-hmm. Certainly one of the reasons I've gone with them is that I feel that with their backers, the Naval Institute Press, hopefully they'll be able to access an audience beyond that, of the beyond that which is reached by a typical comic book store, and we'll be maybe looking more at libraries, museums, regular bookstores. Mm-hmm. For material like this, I think that is very important, because comic book stores still do cater largely to the superhero aficionado, and obviously for a book like this, we have to go beyond that to perhaps a more general audience. Hopefully, we'll do that with the Stringbags. I can tell you that my other war stories have done well enough to survive, well enough that I'm asked to do more, but we can always do better. It could be, as I say, that the Dead Reckoning people can give you a bit more detailed, a bit more precise information on exactly that.
Okay. Did you have any trouble getting this published, or even finished, or did everything go smoothly?
Everything went smoothly. It went very well. It's been a very good experience actually working with the team at Dead Reckoning. Gary Thompson, who really made the thing happen when he first got in touch with me, and the rest of his team have been great, which is a very nice experience because this, after all, none of us have worked together before. This was new to all of us. Now, I have worked with PJ Holden before, so he and I have a kind of shorthand that a writer and artist develop when they work together. But as a publishing enterprise, this is really new for all concerned, and I'm very pleased to say it's gone very smoothly. It's been a very pleasant experience. So, all being well, if the Stringbags does well enough, I'll be able to do something else for them.
Yeah. Well, let me go back in history just a bit. When you pitched your first war comic, like this, did you have issues getting that accepted, or did that go easily?
It depends what you mean, really. That the first, I suppose you would say, pure war comic that I did was a revival of the old DC character Enemy Ace. He was the kind of Red Baron, like Fokker triplane pilot of World War I, who I updated to World War II and gave him a red Messerschmitt 109 instead of his triplane. And I think because it was an old DC character and there was a kind of a fondness for it, and DC, much like Marvel, operate on the principle of just putting stuff out there and hoping for the best. And because I was reasonably successful at the time, they were willing to take a chance on it. I didn't get to do my own original war stories for a couple of years after that, and I think that might have been a harder sell, but at that point Preacher was coming to an end, and it had been a big hit for DC, and they were willing to take really anything I wanted to do. And if that meant World War II stories, well, they weren't sure, but they'd give it a go. I mean, try anything once, right? And I managed to do quite well out of that. I got 2 series of that war story series, and the rest kind of snowballed from there, really. I've done war stories for a number of publishers now, and I find that each has done well enough that I've been able to finish each of the stories concerned. Battlefields, for instance, at Dynamite Entertainment, Dreaming Eagles and Out of the Blue for Aftershock, war stories at DC and then later at Avatar, Sarah, which is one I was very pleased with, for a new outfit, TKO. It seems that there's enough of an audience to get these things off the ground.
Is Stringbags your first one where it's very operationally accurate with fictional characters, or did the ones you mentioned, did they have that same kind of approach as well?
I try to make them as accurate as possible, but the Stringbags has a little more to do with actual events than usual, really just because of the nature of the story, because of the actual specific events, Toronto, Bismarck, Cameldash. With other stories, like, for instance, the Night Witches, or the Tankies, or perhaps Out of the Blue, I've gotten reasonably specific about perhaps campaigns or theaters of war, but not so much specific battles or even particular actions.
Mm-hmm.
So this one is a little bit more specific than most. For instance, in the Night Witches, which is a story about the Russian woman night bomber pilots of World War II,
mm-hmm.
the broad strokes of the story are accurate, the technical details, but I don't necessarily involve the woman crews in any actions or battles that were taken wholesale from real life, the way the events in the Stringbags were.
Mm-hmm. Did you ever have arguments with your editors as far as some historical accuracy you wanted to keep in and the editors wanted to change things for dramatic purposes?
Not really,
okay.
To be honest with you. When it comes to this kind of material, the editors tend to be sort of learning about the events as they read. Dead Reckoning with Gary Thompson and his team would be the first time I've actually worked with anyone with any kind of specialist knowledge for this kind of material at all. Generally speaking, at publishers like Dynamite, DC, Marvel, TKO, Aftershock that I've mentioned, the editors tend to be learning as they read the stories as much as anything else.
Did the Naval Institute Press, I assume their editors looked through it. Did you have that kind of overview done, or?
Well, yes, they were very helpful. Actually, Gary was able to go into their quite enormous archives, in fact, and get PJ in particular a great deal of technical detail on some of the ships that feature in the story, which might otherwise have been very hard to find.
Mm-hmm. Okay, all right. So that adds a layer of, establishes a layer of authenticity,
yes,
working
I think so.
with the press. Okay, cool. That's good to hear. What's your next or current writing project? Can you discuss that?
Right now, in terms of war comics, I have nothing on the slate, as it were. Coming up, I can tell you I want to write about the Battle of Britain. I want to write about the British in Burma, the story of the Chindits. I want to do a story about Canadian bomber crews towards the end of World War II in the Royal Canadian Air Force over Germany. And there are other ideas that are a little bit further off, but those are the ones that I'm most looking forward to starting sometime in the next year or so.
Mm-hmm. And I was going to ask if you thought about stories with Axis characters, and I guess you did mention that one Red Baron type character you did.
Yeah, that's, as I said, that's an old DC character. I have written a few. I wrote a story called The Last German Winter, which was about a German tank crew who lose their tank and end up escorting a little German family through Soviet-held territory towards the end of World War II. And this little family are very grateful to their saviors, but they start to realize that these men have something of a dark secret of their own. I wrote a story called The Tankies. One entry in that particular story involved a British tank crew hunting down and being hunted by a German tank crew. A sort of hunter becomes the hunted kind of story, and the two sides got equal time there. I do try to keep things fairly diverse. I've written stories about American characters. I did one about the B-51 pilots who escorted B-29s from Iwo Jima to attack Tokyo. I did one about B-17s over Germany. Israeli characters. I did one about tank warfare during the Yom Kippur War. And of course the Russians with the Night Witches and Sarah. Sarah's a story about Russian woman snipers during the siege of Leningrad. That said, I do tend to find myself coming back to the British more often than not. That's the reflection of the war comics I read as a kid, which were usually from a British perspective. And also just for me, being an expat Brit, them being the home team.
Yeah. Okay.
That's it. I do, as I say, try to move around a lot. Do try to tell as many different stories as I can. With the Stringbags, as I say, I'm trying to shine a light on an area of World War II that a lot of people may not know about. And that, more than anything else, is what that particular tendency is what guides me.
Okay. Where can people find you on the web? Do you have a web page, social media, that sort of thing?
I do not, and I am not on social media at all.
Okay.
But you can find all my work on Amazon, of course, and the various publishers I've mentioned, like Marvel, DC, Dynamite, Avatar, Aftershock. They all carry my war stories, and you will be able to find them on their particular pages.
And I'll spell, just for listeners who might not be familiar with you, I'll just spell your name quickly for them if they want to Google you.
Sure. Garthennis.
Right. Well, that's all the questions I have. Do you have any final thoughts or words?
Oh gosh, just that I hope people will give the Stringbags a try, and I hope they'll find it entertaining and informing. There's plenty more where that came from.
Yeah,
that is, of course, the kind of question where I immediately dry up as soon as I hear it.
No, I definitely encourage people to look into reading this. It's like you say, I think it's a story not a lot of people are familiar with, and I think they'd get a lot out of it. And the artwork from what I see on the cover looks great, so that's definitely a plus as well. All right, well, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. You can find more podcasts like this on your favorite podcast feed under the title Military History Inside Out. That includes Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and Spotify. One great way to support me is to rate my podcasts, either good or bad. You can find more great military history information at warscholar.org, on YouTube at Warscholar 1945, on Facebook at Warscholar, on Instagram at Chris Alvarez Warscholar, and on Twitter at Warscholar. Please support me by following me on those sites and liking my videos. If you like to read, don't forget to sign up for my weekly newsletter where I recommend newly published books. The subscription box is on my webpage. Thank you.